Welcome back. We're going to take a look in this video at several of the abolitionist movements. In other words, what was the actual plan to end slavery? We'll actually start with the South. The South actually had abolitionists. In fact, many of the founding fathers tended to see slavery as that peculiar institution which needed to go. But many of the founding fathers, as well as Southerners, because they respected tradition, because they respected the Constitution, because they respected the Scriptures, were looking properly for a biblical and just solution to this. So the typical pattern that we see with Southern slave owners who didn't like slavery, or Southerners who didn't like slavery, period, is they typically treated their slaves well. They typically brought them to faith. They typically educated them, and then would free them at their death. In other words, there was almost this kind of malaise or slowness to actually do anything that would be decisive. That's what essentially characterized abolition in the South. Yes, slavery is bad, so we'll treat them well, we'll get them ready for the world, and then we'll free them when we die. In other words, they weren't willing to let go of the slaves who actually provided all these services and all of this profit for them. That's always one of the problems you see with abolition in the South. Another issue was that even though abolition began to grow, especially when slaves grew in price and they began to be more treated like property, and abolitionists who often had no slaves that they owned actually legitimately saw slavery as an evil that needed to end, many of them lost the wind in their sails when a certain occurrence happened. That was the Nat Turner Rebellion. Nat Turner was himself a slave who escaped. He, along with several other slaves who he violently freed, began to go on a violent rampage throughout the countryside in the South. And because this rampage, which actually didn't last that long, but what it did was it scared many of the Southerners into thinking, oh, if we free our slaves and they don't know what to do, perhaps they will turn to violence as well. It, of course, was unfounded. But still, the question that all abolitionists had to face is that if we free the slaves, what do we do next? It doesn't mean you don't free the slaves. It just means they had the question of what happens next. The whole one idea at least, was for them to simply live here, continue on as best as they could. But of course, the problem was, what would that actually look like? And very few were actually willing to think out how that would look. Another idea that was prevalent, especially amongst Abraham Lincoln's cabinet, was to send them back to Africa. In fact, the nation of Liberia was founded by freed American slaves. But the problem with sending them back to Africa is that often meant sending them into a worse culture and a worse government and a worse nation than they actually had over here. Many of them had been over here for generations, so they had no memory of Africa. It'd be kind of like sending the European colonists back to Germany or back to Ireland or back to Scotland. They had been over here so long that they no longer saw those places as home. Furthermore, if they got sent back to Africa, there was a real possibility that they could be recaptured and resold into slavery to some other nation. The North, on the other hand, was much more decisive about ending slavery in the South. They did have the luxury, though, of looking at it from up above and having something that they were not involved in. And so they were often very supportive of abolition, but they were not typically supportive of African Americans themselves. In fact, states like Illinois, Indiana, and Kansas all had laws that forbid the settlement of any free Africans into the North. In fact, there are tales told about militias from Ohio guarding the riverbanks of the Ohio River to forbid any freed Africans from coming into their territory. They saw them as lesser. They were actually had a very racial or racist motivation for keeping them out. Other states also had laws that forbid Africans who resided in the state from voting or from testifying in court. So in reality, even in the North, there was not a great solution for African Americans at this time. They were really caught between a rock and a hard place. And then to compound matters even further, we have the radical abolitionist. These were men who saw slavery as a moral wrong, as a sin, correctly, but they saw it to such a degree that they wanted to turn to violent, revolutionary means to actually end slavery. For example, we have William Lloyd Garrison. William Lloyd Garrison, who was an editor and a journalist, believed that the Constitution should be burned because it allowed for slavery. It really put him in opposition to people like Frederick Douglass, himself a former slave, himself someone who had to reside in Canada to remain free, but realized that the only way for slavery to end would be by legal means. It really shows that Frederick Douglass was a patient man of Reformation who, even though he may have been tempted, did not turn to revolutionary means to actually end these things. William Lloyd Garrison, for example, though, was famous for saying things like this: "Every slaveholder has forfeited his right to live." Or, for example, consider this by another fellow abolitionist. The Reverend George B. Cheever said, "It would be infinitely better that 300,000 slaveholders were abolished, struck out of existence, than slavery continue." This fueled the likes of men like Senator Charles Sumner from Massachusetts, who accused slave masters of all kinds of sexual immorality with their slaves. Sometimes it was actually true, but most of it was unfounded. He was openly hostile. But of course, one of the most hostile was John Brown. John Brown was a man who had incredible experience with slavery, saw it as the great evil of our day or of his generation, and so therefore he went to places like Kansas, which was embroiled in a bitter war, really with people from Missouri trying to make Kansas into a slave state, or versus keeping Kansas as a free state. It was there that Brown actually participated in a massacre in which he and some fellows murdered some 5 people. He would later go on and raise support amongst his followers, and he would raid the government arsenal of weaponry at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, in an attempt to free several slaves and arm them, turn them into a fighting force, and go throughout the South, destroying whoever stood in their way for freeing slaves. In fact, he said this, quoting the New Testament, "Without the shedding of blood, there is no remission of sins." He really did believe that the Southerners, and especially slaveholders, men, women, and children even, would have to die in order for slavery to end. Now, he was right about the fact that a solution to sin would have to be bloody. It's just the fact that he ignored the whole finished work of Christ. Christ had already provided that finished end. He had already provided that bloody means to forgive sin. But still, we're looking at American slavery, which still existed in the days of John Brown. And what slavery needed was it needed a decisive action that was actually legal and just. How that actually occurred is really the unpacking of the war between the states. And as we'll see, it didn't really occur in any kind of ideal way. But we'll unpack that in future videos.